What does it say about a time when even love came with instructions? Why did generations of couples across fields and castles alike find themselves restricted to only one way of expressing affection in bed? And who exactly was watching? Welcome, gentle soul, to Echoes of History, where the past hums softly and the tales we tell are embroidered with truth, imagination, and a smile. Tonight, we part the velvet curtains of a candlelit chamber, one not of royalty or romance novels, but of strict instruction, creaky straw beds, and surprising modesty. The medieval bedroom, for all its whispered longings and shadowy nooks, was far less romantic than the tapestries suggest. In the early centuries of the Middle Ages, affection wasn't exactly a freestyle activity. There existed, curiously, an expectation that even the most private moments between a husband and wife followed a singular script. This wasn't some unspoken custom passed from grandmother to bride. Oh no. It was a well-documented, strongly encouraged, and sometimes strictly enforced behavioral guide. And the favored act? The missionary position, though they didn't call it that, not yet. Why just one? Because it was believed that anything else was unnatural, not just awkward or experimental, but unnatural in a moral, spiritual, and even cosmic sense. Facing one another, the man above and the woman below, was considered the only arrangement that aligned with divine will. Anything else might invite the devil into the bed, and no one wanted a third guest, especially not one with horns. Now imagine this: two newlyweds, perhaps in a stone cottage or a noble bedchamber, dimly lit by a flickering tallow candle. The air smells faintly of wool and wood smoke. One looks nervously to the door, because even privacy was a luxury. And in their minds echoes not poetry or passion, but sermons. That's right, sermons. Priests of the time were surprisingly invested in the finer details of their parishioners' nighttime behaviors. From pulpits and confessionals, they offered reminders about when it was acceptable to engage. Never on Sundays, for example. How often, not too often, of course, and exactly how. A smile might accompany the warning, but the message was clear. Do it right, or risk your soul. And it wasn't just clergy whispering opinions. Medical writers, often monks with an eye on the body and a prayer for the soul, produced manuals warning of the physical dangers of improper positioning. Bent knees might mean bent morals. A sideways glance, a slippery slope. Now, we mustn't laugh too hard. They were serious, and in their own way, concerned. These rules weren't born from cruelty, but rather a deep desire to protect the soul, wrapped in a sincere, if slightly panicked, fear of bodily desire. The flesh, they believed, was weak. The spirit must lead. But the simplicity of this single rule also tells us something gentler, that medieval people, despite the constraints, were trying to do their best in a world of mystery, superstition, and deeply felt faith. They weren't prudish statues. They joked. They wrote songs. They stole kisses behind barns. But they also lived under the weight of invisible eyes. Saints, ancestors, and yes, even scribes, watching from above. It was a strange sort of intimacy, bound by duty, shaped by culture, and always interrupted by drafty windows or livestock noises from the next room. Even nobles weren't exempt. Kings and queens had to obey these quiet codes. though history gives us cheeky hints that some didn't. A certain Henry of England, for instance, might have raised more than just taxes, but in most homes, the expectation remained: face one another, husband above, wife below, as God intended. No funny business, no experimenting, just love, duty, and hopefully a warm blanket. And yet, we can't help but wonder, what if someone broke the rule? What if one curious soul, perhaps after a few too many mugs of honeyed ale, tried something different? What then? Imagine, if you will, lying beside your spouse on a lumpy straw mattress, the air thick with the scent of burning tallow and damp wool. A gentle wind rustles the wooden shutters. Somewhere outside, a rooster crows at the moon instead of the sun. You're not alone in the room. Your mother snores faintly in the corner, and your two youngest children sleep in a bundle of linen sacks at your feet. You reach out a hand to your partner. But then, like a ghost, the words of Father Alaric echo from last Sunday's sermon: Fornicatio prava via est ad infernum. Improper intimacy is a crooked path to hell. And just like that, the moment fizzles like a wet candle. In the medieval mind, the church didn't just guard the altar, it guarded the bedroom. From high-ranking bishops to village priests with mud on their hems, clergy saw themselves as moral architects. And that meant constructing rules, even for how a husband and wife could share their most intimate moments. Now, this wasn't out of spite. The church believed the body was sacred, but also suspicious. It could betray you. Pleasure, while not inherently evil, was slippery. It could lead you from affection to temptation, and from temptation to, well, a lifetime of purgatory. So they created guidelines, strange, oddly detailed guidelines. First came the manuals for confessors, thick, Latin-filled volumes like the Penitential of Burchard of Worms or the Decretum of Gratian. These weren't bedtime reading. Mind you, unless your bedtime included phrases like, "Did you commit the act standing up? That shall be 3 days of fasting on bread and water. Was it during Lent? Double penance. Did you both enjoy it? Too much? Speak to your priest." These texts categorized sins of the flesh in excruciating detail. And yes, even married couples weren't immune. The only sanctioned position was the one deemed natural, man above, facing his wife, with the intent of procreation. Not enjoyment, not recreation, not even affection. Anything else? Labeled deviant, sinful, or, and this word appears often, bestial. And oh, the times you had to avoid entirely. Sundays, the Lord's Day. Fridays, the day of Christ's death. Wednesdays, midweek fasting. Feast days, hundreds of those. Lent, 40 days. Advent, another 40. And if a relative died recently, add a week. That left a few Tuesdays in April. Maybe, but medieval people weren't robots. They had hearts, desires, and more than a few doubts. Many quietly bent the rules. Some outright broke them. That's why priests were so invested in confessionals. Those dark wooden booths weren't just for stolen bread or missed prayers. They were for guilt, real or imagined, about what went on beneath the covers. "Father, my wife and I tried something different." And so began the penance. Fasts, pilgrimages, lashes, prayers, and long days of silence. But here's the twist. While the church disapproved of excessive pleasure, it was also obsessed with regulating it. In a strange way, this made sex a constant subject. In sermons, writings, counsels, and whispers, monks who had never touched a woman wrote exhaustively about how women should behave in bed. Nuns, cloistered away, copied texts that warned against nighttime indulgence. It was paradoxical, suppressing desire by constantly naming it. There were even holy men who taught that angels documented your every move and your every position. The heavenly ledger was always watching. Still, laughter found a way. Villagers told bawdy jokes under their breath. Traveling minstrels sang cheeky songs about priests caught in compromising situations. Behind the curtain, the rules could bend with the wind, especially after a harvest feast or a shared bottle of spiced wine. But overall, the church's influence meant that for centuries, generations of lovers approached the bed with equal parts affection and anxiety. Even love had a checklist, and the fear of damnation was never far from the pillow. Yet, amid all these rules, what did actual couples feel? What did they do behind closed shutters when no one, not even St. Augustine, was watching? A bed is a place of rest, of dreams, of privacy. Or so we think. But in the courts of medieval Europe, the bed was something more. A symbol, a ritual, and, occasionally, a public performance. So imagine golden candlelight flickering off gilded walls, courtiers in stiff silks lining the room like painted statues, and in the center, a massive canopied bed, tall as a carriage, its curtains drawn back like stage drapes. And on that bed, two newlyweds, the future of a kingdom, being gently tucked in under the watchful gaze of bishops, noblemen, and curious cousins. Yes, dear listener, in the medieval world, especially among royalty and nobility, weddings didn't end at the kiss. After the feasting and dancing, after vows were spoken and contracts signed, the most crucial part of a noble wedding was still to come: the bedding ceremony. This strange custom, found in courts from England to the Holy Roman Empire, wasn't just about tradition. It was about proof. Marriage wasn't considered fully binding until it was consummated, sealed not just by words, but by action. And that action, at least symbolically, needed an audience. The practice varied. Sometimes, guests would follow the bride and groom into the chamber, singing bawdy songs, throwing herbs, or shouting cheerful, if slightly embarrassing, encouragements. In other cases, they would stop just short of the bed, waiting while a priest offered a blessing, and noble attendants helped the couple out of their ceremonial garments. Yes, that's right. Disrobing was often a team effort. Ladies-in-waiting untied the bride's corset laces. Gentlemen removed the groom's boots and belt. All very formal, of course. All in good faith. And if there was a hint of mischief behind the lace-trimmed veils, well, gossip was a sport in noble courts. Then, with the couple safely under the covers, the onlookers might withdraw. Or they might not. In some cases, a witness remained in the room, seated discreetly behind a curtain or standing near the hearth, ears perked for the sounds of confirmation. A giggle, a sigh, the shuffle of linen. Proof, however subtle, that the act was complete. Why such scrutiny? Because power hung on that bed. These weren't just lovers. They were alliances in motion, thrones in the making, lands joined by bloodlines. If the marriage wasn't consummated, the union could be annulled. And with it, claims to castles, titles, and whole countries. So the bed became a throne of sorts, velvet draped, perfumed, and politically charged. Now, was it romantic? That depends on your taste in romance. For some couples, it may have been a nerve-wracking ordeal, an awkward dance of duty. For others, especially those who knew each other well, or were at least fond of one another, it was just one more strange ritual in a life of courtly theater. And the truly private moments, they came later, after the doors were closed, after the scribes had written, "The bedding was witnessed," in neat, careful script. Still, the symbolism stuck. Even in smaller noble houses, a version of the public bedding persisted. And villagers, not to be left out, sometimes gathered outside wedding chambers to bang pots and pans or sing raucous songs, a tradition that would later evolve into charivari, a noisy and often unwelcome visit to the newlywed's door. But what does all this say about the medieval view of intimacy? It shows us a world where private acts were deeply public matters, especially when power was involved. The body wasn't just yours. It was a vessel for legacy, for order, for inheritance. It also shows a paradox. On one hand, intimacy was policed and puritanical. On the other, it was paraded in brocade robes under the gaze of bishops. Yet through it all, humanity remained. Nervous laughter, blushing cheeks, slippery garters, and somewhere beneath the gold and obligation, perhaps genuine affection. In a world before TikTok tips and late-night romance guides, where did lovers turn for advice? For the average medieval couple, perhaps a flax spinner and a cooper's daughter, or a plowman and his wife with rough hands and tender eyes, the answers didn't come from experience, but from parchment. And not the fun kind. The medieval bedroom guidebook, as it turns out, was written by celibate men with quills and caution. And yet, these scrolls and volumes shaped generations of understanding about love, the body, and everything in between. Welcome to the world of medieval pillow talk, as imagined through the ink-stained eyes of monks, medics, and moralists. Let's begin with one of the more unintentionally humorous heroes of medieval literature, Constantine the African, a North African translator who, in the 11th century, brought Greco-Arabic medical knowledge to Europe. His texts became the backbone of medieval medicine, and yes, they did discuss bedroom matters. But with the romance of a recipe book. In his writings, you'll find phrases like, "Intercourse is best performed when both humors are warm," and "The womb attracts the seed as a magnet draws iron." Helpful, perhaps, if you were a magnet. Then came Trotula of Salerno, a name you might not expect. A female medical writer. Yes, they existed. Trotula penned advice for women's health that included care for fertility, pain, and yes, even enjoyment. She dared to write that a woman's pleasure was important to conception, a revolutionary idea tucked into a medical compendium that otherwise advised husbands to avoid intimacy if they were too full of wine or garlic. "A cold womb," she wrote, "makes for unhappy results." One can imagine a few modern readers nodding in agreement, but not all texts were so practical. Enter the penitential manuals again. Ever watchful, ever anxious. These guides told confessors how to assign penance based on the sins of the flesh, and they read like awkward diaries from monks who had never met a woman, let alone married one. Sample entry: if a man mounts his wife from behind as one does a beast, he shall fast for 40 days on barley bread. Another: if they lay together unclothed for the sake of heat and not for childbearing, both must confess before Sunday Mass. Heat was a sin. Comfort suspicious. Laughter out of the question. Yet people found their own truths in the cracks between dogma. Old wives passed down herbal knowledge, teas for fertility, roots for desire, poultices for recovery. Midwives whispered wisdom in kitchens and back rooms, tales not written on parchment, but preserved in stories and practice. And troubadours? They sang of love and longing that would scandalize a bishop. Their songs, passed from village to village, painted women as witty and strong, and men as love-struck fools or noble hearts. One such lyric went, "Though God made law for bed and board, my lady's glance makes me ignore the Lord." A cheeky line, and one that reflects a tension humming through medieval life between what was preached and what was felt. Even peasants, who couldn't read the medical texts or confession guides, absorbed these ideas secondhand. The rules of the church were explained during Sunday sermons, during feast days, or by traveling friars who warned of demons that nested beneath bedsheets. One friar famously claimed that improper union could summon a shadowling, a creature born of lust that would whisper curses in the child's ear. That's certainly one way to ruin the mood. But amid the fear and folklore, the human heart persisted. Couples still carved initials into tree trunks. They shared stolen kisses by candlelight. A farmer might bring home a bunch of thyme, not for cooking, but as a token of affection. A woman might plait her hair differently for her beloved's return. Not every touch was governed by parchment. Not every embrace required a monk's permission. Some things in history are named backwards. Take the missionary position, for instance. So called because of a belief, popularized in later centuries, that Christian missionaries introduced it to indigenous cultures as the only proper way to, well, propagate the flock. But that tidy tale is largely a myth. The truth is both stranger and, in its own way, more telling. The position may not have been invented by missionaries, but it certainly became their mandate, long before the term ever existed. And so, let us lay this story bare. In the medieval world, where flesh was suspect and desire required permission, one position emerged as the safest, holiest, and most socially acceptable: the man above, the woman beneath, both facing one another, performing not just a union of bodies, but an act of duty. Not pleasure. Never pleasure. At least, not officially. This position was widely believed to mirror the natural order: man leading, woman following, heaven watching from above. A divine alignment, if you will, from headboard to footboard. As we've seen in earlier chapters, the church was deeply involved in prescribing the when, where, and how of intimacy. And in those rules, the preferred configuration was clear. Anything that deviated, sideways entanglements, standing mischief, or even playful glances, was deemed unnatural, or worse, heretical. One 13th century clerical text warned, Let not the man lie beneath, for he is the head, nor may the woman take the reins, for she is the vessel. A romantic lot, weren't they? But it wasn't just about theology. Medieval medical thought chimed in too. Influenced by ancient Greeks like Galen and Aristotle, scholars believed that bodily fluids flowed more productively when gravity aligned properly. Man above, seed downward. A strange kind of bedroom physics, where love obeyed the laws of Aristotle more than the laws of attraction. It's worth noting that the term missionary position didn't appear in medieval texts. That label wouldn't arise until much later, likely in the 18th or 19th century, whispered into existence by explorers and colonial-era authors. The phrase gained traction in Victorian circles, where prudishness and exotification often danced uncomfortably close. It's said that missionaries, encountering unfamiliar customs abroad, discouraged local practices in favor of what they deemed civilized behavior. Thus, the term stuck, with irony baked right into it. But in medieval Europe, it was simply the way. Or perhaps more poetically, the honest approach. Now, that doesn't mean people didn't know about other options. Of course they did. The Kama Sutra, though not widely read in Europe until later, had long explored a spectrum of human connection. Ancient Roman art, still visible in forgotten villas and crumbled mosaics, depicted poses far beyond what any friar would dare imagine. But in the cold stone bedrooms of medieval Christendom, those images were locked away. In their place, quiet expectation and the firm sense that one method was right and the rest, invitations for demons to dance. Some manuals even tried to link animal behavior to human morals. Horses, who mate front to back, were seen as noble but dumb. Dogs, likewise, loyal but base. Humans, elevated by reason, were meant to love face to face. Eye contact, they believed, was the civilizing difference. The gaze was holy. The rest, feral. Still, there were whispers. Nobles and poets played with metaphor. The Roman de la Rose, that racy allegorical poem adored by medieval French courts, teased its audience with dreamy allusions to gardens and locked gates, keys and fountains. Metaphors, yes, but not subtle ones. And behind drawn curtains, couples were still human. After all, a rule that's too strict only invites curiosity. What if, just once, she was above? What if they faced away from heaven? What if love didn't follow rules at all? But those were private thoughts, hidden beneath woolen blankets and unspeakable smiles. The official stance, however, never wavered. One position, one purpose, one path. A missionary mandate, written not in scripture, but in sighs muffled against the straw mattress. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a bed. Perhaps it's soft and square with crisp linens and feather pillows. Maybe there's a plush duvet, a reading lamp, or even a secret snack tucked beneath the pillow. Now erase all of that, because in the medieval world, a bed was something else entirely. Not merely a place of rest, but a creaking, towering ceremonial stage of daily life, intimacy, illness, birth, and even death. And its design, well, it was decidedly unsexy. Let us climb into it now, carefully. The average medieval bed was tall, not just Oh, that's high tall. But climb a stool and hope you don't sprain your ankle tall. Why? Because drafts and vermin were very real problems in houses without insulation. Cold air settled near the ground, and so did rodents. The higher the bed, the warmer and safer the sleeper. Of course, this elevation didn't lend itself well to spontaneous affection. A stumble could mean a broken wrist, or worse, a witness. Underneath the mattress was often a web of ropes or leather straps stretched across a wooden frame. On top of that sat a tick mattress, usually filled with straw, hay, or, if you were lucky, feathers. But even the best of these sagged with time, causing a peculiar rolling together effect that some couples enjoyed and others did not. And then came the noises. These weren't beds that whispered. No, they groaned, creaked, thudded, and sighed with every shift. Privacy was already rare in a home shared with children, servants, and the occasional goat. And the bed itself wasn't exactly discreet. One roll too many, and the whole room knew. In noble homes, the bed was a status symbol. The frame might be carved from oak or walnut, adorned with gold leaf trim, or even inlaid with religious symbols, just in case God was watching, which He always was. The more important you were, the more canopies you had, layers upon layers of fabric, velvet, damask, heavy linen, hanging down in curtains to ward off cold, flies, and prying eyes. In fact, getting into bed was often a process. A servant would warm the bed with a hot brick wrapped in cloth. Another might fluff the straw mattress. Not that it would help. Nightshirts were handed out, often shared between couples. Chamber pots were placed nearby. Then came the climbing. Once inside, you might find yourself in a space so enclosed by fabric that it felt more like a tent than a bedroom. Intimate, yes, but also claustrophobic, musty, and dark. No candles were allowed inside, of course, too dangerous, which meant most activities occurred by feel, not by sight. Let us not forget the shared nature of sleeping. For peasants and townsfolk, it was not unusual for an entire family to sleep in one bed. Children, parents, sometimes grandparents, all together in one lumpy pile. Privacy? That was a luxury for kings and sinners. Even among travelers and strangers, bed sharing was common. Inns often offered beds, not rooms. A single mattress might be shared by 2 or 3 weary souls who had never met before. It was considered normal, even virtuous, to share warmth on a cold night. But in those close quarters, romance had to be either extremely stealthy or very scheduled. And yet, despite the clunky design, the itch-inducing stuffing, and the groaning joints of ancient wood, the medieval bed held its own kind of sacredness. It was where children were conceived, born, and sometimes lost. Where illness lingered, where lovers met in whispers, where pilgrims prayed before setting out, where kings signed decrees and peasants stitched torn garments by candlelight. It creaked, yes, but it also witnessed. Some beds were even passed down for generations, cherished not for comfort, but for their memories. You didn't sleep in a bed. You inhabited its story. And perhaps that's why even the strictest rules about the one true position were bent behind those heavy curtains. Because once the tapestries were drawn, and the mattress had settled, and the candle had gone out, The only people left were two tired bodies in the dark, navigating the space between duty and desire. It always begins quietly. A stolen glance across the market stall. A hand brushing a sleeve a moment too long. A smile. Not the kind meant for public spaces, but one that lingers, knowing and full of something unspoken. And then the thought. A flicker, small and warm at first, that grows until it curls through the night like smoke. In medieval Europe, that flicker, if acted upon outside the bounds of strict doctrine, could lead straight to the confessional, or worse, to the flames of eternal damnation. At least, that's what many were taught to believe, because in the Middle Ages, passion was not just a private affair, it was a spiritual risk. And when passion stepped out of line, penance was never far behind. Let's say, for a moment, a married couple, tired from harvest, warmed by ale, wrapped in each other beneath scratchy linen, decided to try something new. Not scandalous, just different. A different rhythm, a different angle. Perhaps a moment of playfulness that defied the invisible rule book. And afterward, guilt. Because while no priest stood at the bedside, the teachings of the church slept in the minds of the faithful. They had heard it in sermons. The body was weak, desire was dangerous, and the only sanctioned intimacy was for the purpose of begetting children, and only in the approved manner. If they strayed, even within marriage, it was grounds for confession. Enter the confessor, the priest, often young and often inexperienced, who held a copy of the penitentials and a mind full of instructions. These manuals told him exactly what to prescribe. If a man had relations with his wife in a strange position, fast for 3 days. If it was done for pleasure, not procreation, add a week. If it happened on a holy day, or during Lent, or while standing up, or, heaven forbid, if they had enjoyed it too much. Well, the penance could stretch into months. And lest you think this was a rare occurrence, know this: confession was not optional. It was a sacrament, expected at least once a year, and often encouraged far more frequently. People were told to search their souls for sin, even the secret whispered kind that rustled the sheets and left no visible mark. But what about those who broke the rules completely? The young scribe who kissed the blacksmith's daughter behind the chapel? The widow who dared to take a lover without wedlock? The wandering minstrel who left a trail of rhymed regrets? Their sins were not always forgiven with bread and water. Public penance was a very real spectacle. Some were made to stand barefoot outside the church, wearing sackcloth and ash, holding signs that declared their sin. Others were sent on pilgrimages, long, weary journeys to distant holy sites, barefoot or with peas in their shoes to make each step an act of suffering. In extreme cases, often involving adultery, fornication, or acts considered unnatural, people faced excommunication, branding, or even execution, though the latter was more common in later centuries under civil law than by ecclesiastical decree. And still, people risked it, because love does not consult handbooks. And passion, as history has shown time and again, does not read footnotes. Yet, not all penance was cruel. In some towns, parish priests knew the hearts of their people. They offered gentle guidance, reminded husbands to be kind, wives to be patient, and lovers to be discreet. They turned a blind eye to the occasional indulgence, so long as no scandal followed. even within the church itself, views varied. Some theologians, like the famous Peter Abelard, explored the complexities of love with nuance. Others, like Saint Bernard, warned against even thinking of the flesh. But the people? The people lived in the space between desire and duty, between passion and penance, between what they were told was right and what felt, in their brief moments of connection, like something holy. A glance, a kiss, a night remembered in secret. There were days when the rules loosened their grip, nights when duty gave way to laughter, moments when even the most pious hearts looked away from the altar and toward the bonfire, where drums beat louder than sermons and wine flowed more freely than prayer. Because even in the most rigid corners of medieval life, joy found cracks to pour through. And so did love. Welcome to the world of festive nights, where the candlelight flickered a little wilder, and the church, just for a moment, turned its head. In the agricultural rhythms of the medieval calendar, feast days and seasonal festivals marked more than religious observance. They were valves of release in a life otherwise bound by hardship, hunger, and hierarchy. And oh, how people celebrated. Let us begin with May Day, or Beltane, as it was once called. Celebrated on the 1st of May, it was a festival of flowers, fertility, and flirty chaos. Villagers decorated green boughs, danced around maypoles, and crowned a local maiden as the Queen of May, often accompanied by a blushing green man or May King. But beneath the garlands and songs, there simmered something else. Desire in bloom. Contemporary records, and more than a few scandalized priests' letters, speak of couples disappearing into the woods after the dancing. To gather flowers, of course. It was said that many children born in February and March had their seeds planted under the blossoming trees of Beltane. Clergy tried to tamp it down. They preached against the maypole, calling it a phallic idol. They banned the dances, the bonfires, the songs. But the people, they danced anyway. Because once a year, the air grew thick with warmth, and the body, so long scolded, wanted to sing. Then came Carnival, the great indulgence before the long hunger of Lent. In cities and villages alike, masks were worn, roles were reversed, and no one knew quite who was who. A peasant might dress as a bishop, a widow as a virgin queen. The world turned upside down, and for just a few days, it was deliciously free. Medieval preachers hated Carnival. They wrote furiously about the mischief, the disguises, the laughter, the scandalous behavior behind haystacks. One French priest complained that even the hens forget to lay eggs, so disturbed are they by the noise and sin. But Carnival served a purpose. It let off steam. It acknowledged that people had urges, that they longed not just for virtue, but for permission, if only for a weekend. Weddings, too, were liminal spaces where the rules slipped. Not the public betting, as we've discussed, but the feasting, the drinking, the games. Guests often stayed for days. Songs were sung with lyrics too cheeky for daylight. And if the bride's cousin found herself in a cozy conversation with the groom's friend near the barrels of mead, well, it wasn't uncommon. In some parts of Europe, ritual mock abductions were staged, hearkening back to old tribal customs. The bride might be stolen by her new husband and his friends. With much noise and feigned protest, it was playful, symbolic, and perhaps a bit thrilling. Even church-sanctioned holidays like Christmas and Easter came with a surprising amount of bodily celebration. After midnight mass, there were feasts, and after feasts, dances, and after dances, well, every historian knows that a long winter, a roaring hearth, and a bit of warmed ale were often followed by shared blankets. Records show that many couples conceived children during these supposedly forbidden times. And though the church reminded them sternly that conception during Lent or Advent was spiritually risky, love has always had poor timing. Perhaps most fascinating are the folk rituals tied to fertility, practices older than Christendom, woven into rural life like ivy through a stone wall. In some villages, women who wished to conceive would leap over midsummer fires or sleep beneath hawthorn trees on solstice night. Men might plant phallic-shaped breads in fields or parade livestock decorated with ribbons. These acts, sometimes humorous and sometimes sacred, spoke to a truth that lay beneath doctrine, that love, in all its unruly, inconvenient, laughter-filled messiness, cannot be fully fenced in. Not by bishops, not by manuals, not by bedposts. Even in the glow of firelight, with laughter still clinging to the air and hearts freshly warmed from wine and festivity, fear was never far from the medieval bed. It crept in through the cracks in the shutters. It whispered from under the mattress. It tickled the mind in those quiet moments between touch and sleep. Because for every rule and ritual that governed the bedroom, there were also superstitions, strange, sticky beliefs passed from mouth to ear, from elder to child, as persistent as candle wax and twice as hard to scrape off. In a world where literacy was rare but stories were abundant, people built an invisible framework of saints and spirits, curses and charms meant to heed or guard their most private moments. Even love, especially love, had to navigate a maze of unseen dangers. Start, for example, with the days you were not supposed to lie together. We've mentioned Sundays and feast days, but the list extended far beyond. Lent and Advent? Forbidden. Eve of a saint's feast? Dangerous? Fridays? No chance. Full moons? Questionable. Holy Week? Absolutely not. It might lead to monstrous children. So they said. One popular belief held that children conceived on Good Friday would be born cursed, marked by illness, madness, or worse, a tail. Yes, a tail. A sure sign of divine disapproval. Apparently, then came the watchful saints, though many were called upon for help in marriage or childbirth, like Saint Anne, Saint Margaret, or Saint Joseph. Others were invoked more suspiciously. Take Saint Agnes, the patroness of chastity. Girls were told that if they fasted and slept in silence on the eve of her feast, they would dream of their future husband. But they were also warned, if that dream turned too warm, too vivid, it might be a trick of the devil, wearing the face of a sweetheart. And let's not forget St. Thomas Aquinas, who declared with admirable certainty that intimacy was only pure if it served reproduction and avoided pleasure for its own sake, as if the human heart could be measured in parchment and ink. Of course, the devil himself was a frequent visitor in these superstitions. Many believed that if a couple lay together at the wrong time or in the wrong way, a demon could slip into the room, invisible but not idle. These creatures, known as incubi, were said to seduce women in their sleep, while succubi visited dreaming men. A restless night? A guilty conscience? A strange dream? That wasn't your imagination. That was a visitor. To guard against this, some households kept garlic under the bed or nailed iron keys to the headboard. Others chalked crosses on the wall or muttered prayers passed down from grandmothers with crooked fingers and sharp eyes. Even the bed itself was richly protected in many homes. It was not unusual for a midwife, especially in more rural communities, to bless a mattress before a newlywed couple lay in it for the first time. Perhaps the most curious superstition of all was the fear of conception without the soul. Some believed that if intimacy occurred too soon after childbirth, during menstruation, or on certain cursed nights, the resulting child might be born empty, physically whole but soulless, doomed to wander or die young. This fear led many couples to abstain for long periods, not out of respect or exhaustion, but terror. A ghost child was worse than no child at all. And who enforced these fears? Not the priests alone, but mothers, aunts, neighbors. The church offered rules. The people embroidered them with fear. Still, not all was dark and cautionary. For every warning, there was a charm. A sprig of rosemary placed under the pillow was said to bring passion and harmony. St. John's wort hung over the bed could ward off evil. A silver coin beneath the mattress would ensure fertility. In some villages, couples even performed blessing dances around their bed before consummation. Simple, awkward circles done by candlelight, half sincere and half laughing, to make sure the spirits stayed kindly and the sheets stayed safe. Because for all their fears, medieval people weren't without hope. They knew love was fragile. They knew the night could be strange. But they also believed in their saints, their charms, and each other. Behind every shuttered window, beyond the public rules and the polished sermons, there was another kind of voice. Quiet, rarely recorded, but no less present. It belonged to the woman. And though medieval society painted her often as obedient, silent, and saintly, confined to the bed, the hearth, or the cloister, the truth is far more textured. Because behind the curtains, when no monk was watching and the candles burned low, women spoke. And they were not always meek. In the official records, women were the receivers of husbands, of sermons, of instruction. But in the daily rhythm of life, in whispered conversations over laundry, in the hush of twilight, in birth chambers and bedchambers, women pass down knowledge too quiet for parchment. Much of this knowledge began in the domestic spaces, where women reigned not as servants, but as keepers of lore. Take, for instance, the midwives. Midwives were more than birth attendants. They were herbalists, counselors, protectors. They knew which teas soothed a trembling belly, which roots might delay a conception, and which oils could warm a nervous bride's body. They whispered secrets to new wives on wedding nights, not just about survival, but about pleasure, patience, and power. And though the church tried to regulate them, many midwives practiced what we might now call folk feminism, a slow, steady defiance of the idea that a woman's body belonged solely to God, husband, or priest. In their hands, the bedroom was not just duty, but craft. Then there were the wives and widows who learned to negotiate affection like merchants. A glance could say, "Not tonight." A silence could say, "I'm angry." A well-placed loaf of honeyed bread might soften a temper. And a strong-willed woman could often guide a marriage with subtlety, long before men realized it. Marriage, after all, was not always chosen. But intimacy within it could be shaped, and many women, especially those with age, confidence, and a kin behind them, became quiet architects of their own agency. There are records of women refusing advances, not publicly, of course, but in private, using headaches, spiritual vows, or cleverly timed fasts. They learned, as women often do across time, to say no without saying no. And some, bolder still, said yes, but on their own terms. What about nuns? Ah, the cloistered women, so often imagined as meek and cloaked in silence. Yet, within those stone walls, many nuns read, wrote, and questioned. Some, like Hildegard of Bingen, penned detailed texts on the female body, pleasure, and divine union. Her visions, celebrated by popes and poets alike, blended spiritual ecstasy with sensual language that made many male theologians blush. She wrote of the womb as a chamber where the light of life kindles. And she did not shy away from the power of female sexuality, though she cloaked it in divine metaphors. Other nuns, in letters to each other, wrote of deep affection, of longing, of dreams they dared not speak aloud. Even behind convent walls, women found ways to explore their voices, sometimes in poetry, sometimes in coded diary entries, and sometimes in rebellious laughter during evening chores. And what of the unmarried, the so-called maidens and spinsters? They were not all lonely. Some were independent artisans, widows with property, or healers with reputations that rivaled the local clergy. And while society often tried to label them as strange, cursed, or pitiful, many of these women lived by their own compass, even if it meant facing suspicion or slander. They knew their herbs. They knew their prayers. They knew that a world that did not listen to women still needed them to whisper. In truth, medieval women were not passive vessels of obedience. They were strategists of survival, stewards of generational wisdom, and in many cases, protectors of joy. And when it came to the bedroom, that creaky, straw-stuffed stage of ritual and romance, women were not always silent participants. They had preferences. They had tactics. They had opinions. Only the bravest wrote them down, but the rest, they taught with touches, with tone, with the inherited instincts passed from mother to daughter in kitchens and corners. Let us step out of the castle now, away from the velvet curtain beds and golden candlesticks, away from manuscripts and midwives, saints and secrets. Let us walk into the muddy lanes of the village, past the thatched roofs and low stone walls, into a peasant's home, if it can be called that. One room, one fire, one bed, if any. And here, in this cramped and smoky space, intimacy lived a very different life. For the vast majority of medieval people, privacy was not a concept. It was a luxury as distant as a king's coin or a poet's parchment. In a single-room cottage, home to 6 or 7 souls, and often a goat or chicken or two, there was no separate chamber for love, no doors to close, no flickering candlelight to set a mood. A husband and wife might share a wooden sleeping bench covered with straw, perhaps with a woolen blanket or 2 stitched by hand. Their children, infants to teenagers, likely slept nearby, on pallets of hay or rough cloth, often within arm's reach. In winter, whole families huddled together under a single covering to conserve warmth. And yet, within this tangle of limbs and labor, love still found its place. The peasant bedroom, if it can be called that, was a space of negotiation. When to sleep, when to speak softly, when to reach for a hand under the blanket and hope the baby was finally quiet. It required discretion not because of modesty, but because there were always ears nearby. A creak of the bed, a rustle of hay, a giggle in the dark. These were not just sounds, they were warnings. Many couples learned to make love in silence, in stillness, or in moments borrowed from the chaos of daily life, perhaps while the children fetched water, or during a midday break in the fields, or late at night after the fire died and the dog had curled itself to sleep by the door. And yet, even in such closeness, there were rules, social and unspoken, that governed intimacy. Parents, for example, were expected to make themselves scarce once children reached a certain age. Not physically, of course. There was no spare room to move into. But emotionally, a subtle shift, a turning of backs, a lesson passed not in words, but in carefully chosen silences. Children, too, learned the dance. They learned when not to look, when not to ask, when to cover their ears or step outside if their parents' voices grew low and muffled after nightfall. It was not shame exactly, but a kind of communal courtesy rooted in necessity. Interestingly, while nobles treated the bedroom as a site of ritual and law, peasants treated it as life, as natural and unavoidable as milking the cow. There were no theological debates about angles or intentions. There was work to do, mouths to feed, and sleep to snatch between tasks. And when it came to reproduction, the focus was not on sin, but survival. More children meant more hands. More hands meant more harvest. So, while the church's rules filtered down through sermons and festivals, they were often interpreted with flexibility by those who didn't have the time or the luxury to follow them to the letter. A priest might preach abstinence during Lent. A farmer might nod respectfully and return home to his wife. Still, the church tried. It sent friars into villages to warn against beastly acts and excessive warmth. It scolded couples for lying together naked, even in winter. It declared that certain acts, even between married peasants, could lead to spiritual rot. But the villagers? They listened politely, then carried on. Because in the world of the peasant, love was not sacred or sinful. It was practical. It was human. It was found in a shared loaf of bread, in a gentle touch after a hard day's labor, in two bodies finding heat in the depths of January. And if that love came wrapped in a little laughter, a whispered joke, or an awkward moment of clumsiness, all the better. Joy, too, was a kind of rebellion. The candle is lit. The sermon is forgotten. The rules, spoken by priests, etched into dusty parchment, lie silent in the shadows. Tonight, they will be broken. Because even in the age of obedience, not everyone obeyed. There were those who challenged the single-position mandate, not with weapons or rebellion, but with whispers, laughter, and love that dared to move differently beneath the sheets. Some were noble rebels, whose fame shielded them from censure. Others were poets and pranksters, whose verses teased at the absurdity of rigid laws. And many were simply ordinary people, tired of guilt clinging to their skin like cold sweat. So how did they break the rules? By trying something new, not in the streets or squares, but in the quiet places where curiosity blooms. In 14th century France, a woman named Beatrice, a widow free of husband and household master, was reported by a neighbor for keeping company with a younger man in a manner unbefitting. The court records accused her of encouraging positions unsanctioned by God. But Beatrice, when questioned, replied calmly, "If God gave us joints, surely He meant for us to use them." No one knew what to do with her. She wasn't exactly wrong. And yet she wasn't exactly safe either. She was fined, lightly, and then returned to her house. And her lover. Tales like hers surfaced quietly, usually in confessionals or legal records. A woman in Cologne was punished not for adultery, but for admitting she enjoyed being above her husband. A merchant in Milan confessed, not out of guilt, but confusion. He had discovered a new form with his wife and wanted to know if it was permitted by Rome. The priest told him to fast for a week. He fasted, then did it again. Yet beyond the courts and confessionals, there existed an entire genre of literature that laughed in the face of bedroom laws. These were the fabliaux, short, bawdy tales popular in France and Italy. Written in the vernacular and performed for common folk, they painted vivid pictures of lusty monks, clever wives, and bumbling husbands outwitted by desire. One famous fabliau tells of a woman who pretends her husband has been cursed, and that the only cure is to make love to her in a new and acrobatic manner. The story ends with the man exhausted and the audience roaring with laughter. The message was clear. People knew the rules, and they knew how to twist them. Even in noble courts, where conduct was closely watched, courtly love played by different rules. While the official stance remained strict, poems and songs of the era celebrated forbidden passion. Love that was secret, physical, and thrilling. These romances didn't dwell on positions or penance. They lingered on longing. They praised desire. In these stories, the act itself wasn't sinful, only beautiful and bittersweet. One 13th century poem reads, "She rode him like a stallion fair. No priest could see, no saint would care." Cheeky, blasphemous, and deeply human. But not all defiance came with rhymes and winks. Some paid dearly. In stricter regions, especially as Europe moved into the later Middle Ages, breaking sexual norms could be punished harshly: flogging, exile, or public shaming. Those who engaged in acts considered unnatural by church doctrine were sometimes condemned as heretics, or worse. And yet, the rules kept breaking, because desire is older than dogma, because curiosity can't be silenced with sermons, and because love, in its raw, awkward, tender, clumsy, joyful truth, refuses to stay inside the lines drawn by trembling quills. So, where does this leave us? With a truth not written in manuals or carved into stone, that even in the most rule-bound eras, people sought their own truth in love. They listened to instinct. They listened to each other. And when the world looked away, they tried something new. Sometimes it was wrong. Sometimes it was wonderful. But always it was theirs. In a small village tucked between muddy fields and mossy woodlands, an old woman stirred a pot of bubbling herbs over the hearth. She wasn't a priest nor a scholar. She had no Latin. But the people called her the Herb Mother. and her recipe for love courage, a syrup of honey, thyme, and ground snail shells, was whispered about for miles around. Because in medieval times, when the body misbehaved or the heart wavered, one did not consult a therapist or search for answers online. One went to the healers. And that's when the hilarity often began. Medieval medicine was a peculiar mix of ancient philosophy, religious doctrine, folk tradition, and imaginative guesswork. The body, it was believed, was governed by the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. And every aspect of health, including intimacy, was linked to the balance, or mischief, of these fluids. Too much cold and wet? You might lose your natural vigor. Too much heat and dryness? You could become uncontrollably lustful. Too many beans? Disaster. So it's no surprise that doctors and healers of the age gave bold and wildly creative advice on matters of the bedroom. For example, to encourage fertility, men were told to eat roasted rooster testicles for strength, leeks dipped in goat's milk to awaken the seed, bread baked on the thighs of a virgin. This was rare. Women, meanwhile, were advised to avoid cold foods, lest their wombs grow sluggish. They were encouraged to drink teas of fennel and ash bark, sleep facing east, and bathe with pebbles soaked in wine. Pebbles that had first been whispered to by a priest, of course. And for those who feared their marital flame had dulled, enter the love potions. Love potions in the medieval era were less magical than myth suggests, but no less curious. Recipes varied from the sweet and symbolic to the truly stomach-churning. A mild one might include honey-crushed rose petals, a pinch of saffron, a poem whispered while stirring. A stronger and far less romantic version could feature powdered deer antler, dried frog skin, a drop of blood, animal or otherwise. And if all else failed, some suggested boiling a pair of lovers' undergarments together while chanting a rhyming couplet under the full moon. Desperate times, desperate measures. Doctors, especially those trained in monastic schools, often approached intimacy as a matter of logistics. Medieval physician Bernard de Gordon warned in his Lilia Medicinae that excessive intimacy could cause exhaustion of the spinal marrow, leading to forgetfulness and crooked posture. Another warned that too much bedroom activity could cause the eyes to sink into the head and the cheeks to appear hollow with guilt. Even Hildegard of Bingen, the famed abbess and mystic, wrote with surprising frankness on such matters. She described the pleasure of intimacy as a small spark of the divine fire. She believed in its beauty, but only within balance and sacred purpose. Her prescription for a lukewarm lover: a blend of ground cinnamon and cloves, taken with wine warmed under sunlight. Among common folk, remedies were passed down like heirlooms, often shared in confidence between women, or between lovers who trusted each other enough to laugh at the strange instructions. A peasant might chew parsley to avoid pregnancy, or wear a garlic braid to chase away infertility demons. A man might rub the juice of onions on his feet, believing it would draw heat upward and restore his desire. Some women placed amulets beneath the bed, bones carved with ancient runes, or ribbons embroidered with secret wishes. Were these effective? Who's to say? But they gave people a sense of control in a world where medicine was mostly a mystery, and pleasure came with a long list of caveats. Yet, amid the strangeness, there was sweetness too. There were love herbs that did relax the mind: lavender, chamomile, mugwort. There were warm baths drawn by candlelight with petals and oils. There were gentle touches, whispered laughter, and remedies brewed not just for health, but for hope. Because whether it came in the form of a charm, a syrup, or a steaming bowl of soup seasoned with sage and flirtation, healing in the medieval bedroom was as much about the heart as the body. And sometimes just the act of trying, of caring, of stirring, of showing up with herbs and good intentions was the best medicine of all. There's a quiet before every storm. And in the world of the medieval bedroom, with its whispered rules, creaking beds, and centuries of sacred limitation, that storm began not with thunder, but with books, with ink, with travel, with laughter in new languages, and lovers who dared to ask, what if? The Middle Ages did not end with a bang, but with a shift, a slow, irreverent, thrilling turn of the page. This was the Renaissance, and with it came a rebellion, not just of art or science or philosophy, but of intimacy. It began in Italy, Florence to be precise, where poets rediscovered the flesh, not to fear it, but to celebrate it. Petrarch wrote of longing and kisses not as temptations, but as poetry. Boccaccio's Decameron, a collection of scandalously clever tales, featured characters who outwitted clergy, indulged in secret romances, and treated desire not as sin, but as sport. It was funny. It was human. It was liberating. The readers, often nobles and merchants who had grown weary of austere sermons, read in private and passed copies hand to hand like precious contraband. Soon, what had once been unspoken began to stir at dinner tables, in salons, and yes, behind curtains where once only fear had slept. But it wasn't just fiction. Scholars began to question everything. Classical texts, long buried in monasteries or dismissed by theologians, were translated anew. The writings of Galen, Hippocrates, Ovid, and even the lusty Roman poet Catullus returned, their ideas reshaped for a new age. Among them, the ancient belief that pleasure, when shared with love and moderation, could be natural, even good. Medical texts no longer warned against too much joy in the bedroom. Some, in fact, began to suggest that mutual satisfaction improved health and harmony within marriage. Imagine that. With printing presses now humming across Europe, these ideas were no longer locked in abbeys or whispered in university halls. They were mass-produced, portable, inevitable. A curious young woman in Venice could now read the same material as a learned man in Paris, perhaps even scribble her own notes in the margins. And some did. Women began to publish poetry, letters, and treatises, many of them exploring emotion and desire with new boldness. Isotta Nogarola wrote of love as both sacred and physical. Marguerite de Navarre, a queen and intellectual, penned stories that critiqued hypocrisy in church teachings, particularly around marriage and lust. Their words weren't angry. They were clever, subtle, precise, and they cracked open doors that had long been sealed. Meanwhile, the bedroom itself began to change. Furniture became more ornate, more comfortable. Silk replaced coarse wool. Feather mattresses became fashionable among the elite. Privacy, once reserved for royalty, began to trickle down into middle-class homes. with actual bedchambers replacing the all-in-one living space of earlier generations. With privacy came possibility, and with possibility came experimentation. Not everyone leapt into new positions or abandoned the teachings of their ancestors, of course. But the tone shifted. Where once there had been only one innate way, missionary, man above, eyes to heaven, now there were whispers that perhaps there were other ways to love. The church naturally resisted. It condemned certain books, banned others, and excommunicated those who pushed too far. But even bishops could not stop the tide. After all, many of the clergy were reading these new texts too. Some in private, some in denial, others perhaps with more interest than they admitted. The world was changing, and not only in matters of love. People began to see themselves differently, not as sinners crawling toward salvation, but as thinking, feeling beings capable of reason, beauty, and joy. The body was no longer the enemy. It was a vessel, a canvas, a partner in the dance of being human. And so, the old bedroom rules began to loosen. Not all at once, not everywhere, but in hearts and poems and books passed beneath tables and quiet smiles shared in the half-dark. It was the beginning of a new intimacy, one that allowed room for tenderness, play, humor, curiosity, and yes, choice. It began in shadows, with whispering saints, curtain beds, and ink-stained rules written by men who feared what they couldn't name. It journeyed through guilt, through flickering fears of sin and demons, through one position blessed and all others banished. Through festivals where laughter dared to break the silence, through women's whispers, healers' herbs, rebels' rhymes, and scribes who tucked secrets between the lines of books. And slowly, tenderly, the story of the medieval bedroom stepped into the light. The candle was lit. By the time the Renaissance spilled into the Enlightenment, the old world of rigid rules had begun to fracture. Faith still mattered, yes, but so did reason, curiosity, science, and with it came a renewed interest in the body, not as a battleground, but as a vessel of wonder. Anatomists mapped the curves of muscle and bone with the same reverence they once reserved for cathedrals. Physicians, while still flawed in their assumptions, began to ask how and why, not just when and where not. Pleasure was no longer exclusively a temptation. It became a subject, something to be explored, studied, even improved upon. By candlelight, lovers read poetry aloud. They exchanged letters scented with lavender. They learned not just the positions of the stars, but the positions that brought comfort, laughter, and yes, joy. The medieval fear of the bedroom as a site of sin gave way slowly to something gentler, the idea of intimacy as connection. Of two people, not simply fulfilling duty, but learning each other's rhythms. But the past never truly disappears. It lingers in the language we use, words like proper, decent, natural. In the unspoken rules passed down through generations, in the discomfort some still feel when pleasure is named out loud. The medieval rules, especially the famous one position only rule, echo even now in jokes, in awkward silences, in the tug-of-war between tradition and freedom. And yet, their legacy isn't just about restriction, it's about resilience. Because through it all, from the cold stone walls of abbeys to straw-filled beds in village huts, people still loved. They still touched each other gently after long days. They still found warmth in a partner's palm. They still broke the rules, not out of rebellion, but out of instinct, out of kindness, out of longing. Today, our bedrooms look different. Feather beds have been replaced by memory foam, curtains by doors, parchment by podcasts. But the questions, they remain. What is allowed? What is sacred? What is shared? What is ours? And the answers still vary, as they always have, from person to person, culture to culture, moment to moment, because intimacy was never meant to be a single story. It was always a conversation, a dance, a question asked in darkness and answered with a hand reaching back. So perhaps the truest legacy of the medieval bedroom is not in its rules, but in the quiet defiance that bloomed within them, in the woman who laughed beneath her veil, in the man who chose tenderness over control, in the priest who forgave more than he condemned, in the midwife who handed down potions and wisdom in equal measure, in the candle, however small, that kept burning, even when the night was long. We've come a long way from those days. We've added chapters, we've changed the language, we've lit new candles. But somewhere, deep in the folds of history, the echoes still hum. We were here. We loved. We tried to understand one another in a world that rarely made room for it. We made room anyway. And now, dear listener, gentle heart, curious soul, you've walked with us from shadow to flame, from whispered fears to open windows, from the single position allowed to the many stories now shared. May you carry these tales not as burdens, but as lanterns, not as rules, but as reminders that love at its best defies even time. If you've enjoyed this journey through medieval bedroom rules, only one position allowed, we invite you to stay with us. Subscribe to Echoes of History, where each series brings you closer to the lives, loves, and laughter of those who came before us, not as relics, but as reflections. And if this tale moved you, warmed you, or made you smile even once, light a candle tonight, in memory, in mischief, in love. Good night.